Devise and Conquer. I'm your host, Michelle, regulatory specialist by day and podcast guide by, well, also day. Well, actually, for me, I feel like I eat, breathe, sleep, and for sure dream about this stuff. So, this is my sidekick, Ty, and today we are going to talk about MDR, more than just red tape. And if you already don't know what MDR is, you're going to wish you did know after this. It's the medical device regulation in Europe.
You're in for a wild ride. And every time I see a box of bandages or really any medical device thing, I I always look to see if it's got a CE mark label because you
Do they
get
even
to
bother?
do it.
Because it's so hard to get a CE mark.
Yep.
Talking a little bit about, we're going to get into deeper details about CE marking and MDR and all those changes. But in our last episode, we unpacked what was a medical device and not a medical device in our real or ridiculous segment. And so hopefully all of you had left your comments about what you think is real and ridiculous. We're going to go through the answers now. So go back and listen to that one if you want to get the original list.
Yep. So first up, was a smart spoon for Parkinson's real or ridiculous? It is real. It's FDA regulated. There's a whole category for what's called a GMP exempt device. So it's good manufacturing practices exempt. The requirements are very low, but it is a real medical device. You can register and list, and there's a whole category for these assisted devices for, geriatric patients and, patients with things like Parkinson's or Alzheimer's or people who just have mobility issues in general.
What about our mood ring that detects cancer?
Yeah.
So no, that one's fake. It sounds something more like you could see on Instagram than FDA website.
Definitely fake. Definitely not a medical device.
Yeah.
At least
So,
not yet.
but hey, you know what? Now that we said that out loud, do you know what my Instagram feed is gonna it's gonna send me?
Or we're going to see some published biometric device that might surprise us there, but not a
Yep.
mover. All right.
So next, Ty, what about your smart knee implant?
Nope, that one is very, very real. So Zimmer Biomet made a smart knee that basically, as part of a total knee replacement, it measures your steps, range of motion, and connects to an app. So doctors can kind of determine how compliant you've been, if there's modifications they need to make to your physical therapy after you get a total knee replacement. It was actually a breakthrough device and got special clearances. It's also endorsed by Arnold Schwarzenegger, which is
Fun
like
fact.
both perfect and weird that he has a game in medical devices. But, knee implants impact a lot of people. So it's pretty cool.
Especially people that have spent a lifetime abusing their knees.
Mhm.
So, exercise equipment like resistance bands and dumbbells, I think would surprise a lot of people that if you claim by using the exercise equipment, it will help you lose weight, then FDA says that that is a medical device because obesity is a medical condition. And very technically, anybody that has exercise equipment should probably be registered with the FDA to the tune of $10,000-12,000 a year to
Yep.
legally sell their GMP exempt exercise equipment that makes medical claims.
I mean, you have to be clear that you're trying to lose it weight because it's the intended use of obesity or treating obesity that is what puts it in a medical device category. But there are product codes for these devices, and you can, as Michelle mentioned, register and list. So, and the smart diaper, that's real too. And this one is super nuanced because depending on who's using it and how you're using it, it can be a medical device or it can just be a product. So if it's a smart diaper for geriatric patients or for a patient population that is maybe non-responsive, non-verbal, adults, and they're using adult diapers and there's a sensor that says, hey, their diaper is wet, that is a medical device. Adult diapers are GMP
And
exempt
it's telling
products.
you about a medical condition of incontinence in a population that should otherwise be continent.
And it's also got biometric feedback. So all of those things make it not even a GMP, a good manufacturing practice, low risk exempt device. There are real requirements for these. So,
Mhm. But
but
and what
baby,
about for a baby?
yeah, but for babies, their diapers aren't considered medical devices because babies are not incontinent. They are, developing the skills and muscles in a natural state of progression, not actually because of a medical condition to kind of hold, their urine and bowel.
Everybody is born that way, so it's not a medical condition.
That's exactly right.
Mhm.
And then
Well, what
Michelle,
about this?
what about your focus band?
Boy, I would sign up for this if there was such a thing as a cognitive drift tracker, because I'm always out in a rabbit hole somewhere in my brain. So it does sound a bit sick, but there's nothing remotely like it that's cleared by the FDA yet. Also, again, maybe now it's going to show up on my Instagram saying these things out loud, but I also have not really seen anything like this come across my Instagram feed either.
Wow. Right now, we don't know, but in the future, maybe. So how did you do? Did any of those trip you up? Did you kind of get most of them right, or were you surprised?
Leave us a comment if any of them caught you off guard. But for now, let's get back to our topic at hand, and that's the MDR medical device regulation. Formally, it is known as the EU regulation for 2017/745, which came into supposedly full effect in May 2021. It replaced the MDD, or the Medical Device Directive, which had been around since the early 90s. Um, and so, you need to think of this as like replacing your old flip phone with a smartphone. All of this is a pretty big leap all at once. Um, but unless your flip phone also determined whether surgical implants were safe or not, probably not, because your smartphone, maybe so.
Maybe. Yeah, as
Mhm.
Michelle mentioned, it's not a cosmetic upgrade. I remember when I had a flip phone and I like tried to get on the internet and then you frantically try to press cancel because it'd be like $2 for internet connection. It would be so expensive. Um, but with your smartphone, you don't even think about it. Well, with MDR, it's not a cosmetic upgrade. There's actually so much new information, new classifications of devices, new expectations on industry players, on clinical data. It's an overhaul, much like your smartphone is an overhaul to my old Razor.
Mhm.
You would hold them side by side and you wouldn't even begin to see the comparisons other than you
And
could make a phone call.
just even in a sheer volume, the MDR is like 170 pages, and the MDD was like less than 70. So,
Yeah.
I mean, it is like a magnitude of difference in the scope of the regulation versus the directive.
And you have to think about the age of the MDD too, with the way technology has driven with like AI driven software and all of the scandals, PIP, breast implants, you know, regulators had to make a change. They had to tighten things up.
Mm. So I don't know that if our audience really knows much about the PIP scandal, because that was a hot minute ago. But for those of you who don't know, PIP stands for this French company, Poly Implant Prostheses. And they had made breast implants for decades. They had they made a material change. They lied to their notified body that they made the material change. They did not do required testing, performance testing, strength testing on that changed material. And then these implants got implanted in women all over the world. And they would imagine being on a flight somewhere and the pressurization on the flight caused your boob to erupt. It break. Like
Not a
it
good
was
time.
that dramatic. And so these implants started rupturing in women all over the world. And so the competent authority went and did their own audit of the pit factory and found that they had a material that was not only not described in their approval package for that implant, but then they were had also falsified all the data around it as well. So that's kind of a bit, it was a perfect storm. Pitt came at the perfect storm for all these things that were happening in discussions around the medical device directives and if they were adequate enough to ensure patient safety.
Yeah, and so they were also using, I believe, industry grade silicone instead of medical grade silicone. And I believe there were multiple what's now under EU MDR being called like formally designated economic operators, but there were lots of different suppliers. And so because there were so many different places to look, the notified bodies couldn't really catch it
Mhm.
because
And
there
it's a
were,
sampling. You don't audit every single product every single time.
yep. And so, it was just the fallout was massive, as it should be, right? Like, you're talking about tens of thousands of women whose lives were, you know, irreparably changed, and, you know, fines and money are never gonna give you your health back. But lawsuits were made, recalls were made, you had to have expert witnesses testify to other breast implants, making sure that they weren't doing it. And ultimately, we talked about how The Jungle by Upton Sinclair started to kind of cause FDA to exist with the Food and Drug Act. But this was kind of the last straw to make MDD, transition out into what's called the medical device regulation, because a regulation is a law, a directive is
It's
a
more of a
sort of law.
yeah. It has to be formally adopted by each member state, and a regulation applies across the entire EU. The member states cannot pick and choose to acknowledge it or not. So the
Yep.
way that they finally got busted is the competent authority came in and walked up to one of the machines that was making the implant and wrote down the name of the material on the from the box of resin or silicone that was at the press, and then traced it back to their technical documentation and found that it was nowhere in their technical documentation and that their internal records didn't have any of the testing to support the change. So one of my big problems though is that the pit, you can't legislate integrity.
Yeah.
And so the problem is that under MDD, it was there was already a large paperwork burden and expectation. And the MDR triples, at least triples the
Yeah.
amount of documentation and testing and visibility that companies have to have. So if you're a company that lacks integrity and you're already going to lie and falsify under the MDD, how is adding triple the amount of documentation going to make it a more safe and effective product? Because now you're just going to lie three times over,
Yep.
you know? So to me, it did not, it's a disconnect when the European Union says that they put the MDR in place to protect their patients.
It's it's a little bit of a an overcorrection, at least in the interpretation of how notified bodies are performing right now and what we're seeing in industry. So it's a really challenging time in industry. We've had multiple, transitionary periods. Michelle and I are eating, breathing, sleeping this stuff. We're working with small clients, for the most part, so, small, mid-sized companies, and they're just really having to eat the cost of this company falsifying the data. And MDR really did an overhaul of a number of subsystems under it. And it was supposed to be risk-based with, class 1 devices being least risky, class 3 being most. But what they did do was change the classification rules so that a lot of long-standing existing technology, been on the market 20, 30 years, that hasn't had any problems, was now up classified and, you know, are really struggling to eat the cost of the expected documentation the notified body wants to see for products that have had 30 years on the market with no incidences. There's some good that came out of it because the classification
Let's
rules did.
also be clear about they up classified things that were previously class 1 and self-declared to
Yeah.
where now they required a notified body involvement in their clearance or approval to get on market in the EU. So there are
Yeah.
all kinds of products that used to not be subjective to oversight in the EU, direct oversight, that now are.
Yeah. And some of it makes sense and some of it's a little, it's up to your discretion. They created the whole new class 1R. So this is for reusable products. They wanted to actually, instead of, being self-certified for things like hemostats or surgical trays or, metal surgical instruments that often get reused, they need to now see a technical file because they want to make sure that you have sterilization validations for those reprocessing. um, you know, they've been on the market for a long time, and mostly those hospitals perform their own validations anyway. So that's just one. There are some
Mhm.
good examples of that because they did put some more regulations around software, which used to be primarily self certify. And, it's a little scary to
What's
get
the software now?
softwares
280.
that are, claiming diagnostics or really even heavily for adjunct diagnostics where doctors are really relying on results to not have a notified body review. But because MDD was so old, there weren't, software, it just isn't what it was even 15 years ago. Even 3 years ago, we're seeing right now the rapid advancement of AI being everywhere with ChatGPT and Gemini and all of those. So you can imagine that the classification rules were outdated. But it's a bit of a mixed bag, whether it was helpful or
Right.
hurtful for
So we
industry.
talked about the amount of documentation that changed. We've talked about the classification rules that changed. What are some more of the kind of nuts and bolts that MDR brought in above and beyond the MDD?
Yeah, so we've also kind of talked about economic operators. I've used that word, but it's really about anyone who touches the product now is really going to be held responsible. And part of that is because PIP had all these suppliers that didn't make any flags, because they weren't really ultimately responsible for the change. But I've seen people who have contract manufacturers in the EU and their spec developers in the US, and now the contract manufacturers feel like they have to have a whole recreated design history file because of this economic operators pressure to make sure that products are created. And so if you're a distributor, an importer, an authorized representative, a contract manufacturer, a specification developer, your role is even more strict and clear. And industry needs to be very clear. They want to see
And
a
these are
lot
people
less.
that didn't have requirements at all before.
Yes, and they have requirements now.
And
It's
we've
it's
had customers that are fighting tooth and nail. Their importers and distributors because their importers and distributors are lagging and saying they don't have responsibilities, and they very clearly do. Then the client gets a write-up from their notified body because their importer or distributor downstream isn't compliant.
Yeah, and it's really challenging for companies, especially small, mid-sized companies that might have different doing business as names, like white labeling names, or if they have, a certain branch of their business does just the design and another one does contract manufacturing. notified bodies aren't doing a great job of understanding nuanced relationships, and they're very much putting their foot down on nuanced business relationships and not wanting to accept the flexibility that's needed for companies that just can't do it themselves. They don't have multi-million dollar revenue streams or billion dollar revenue streams, and they're a very specific focus. There's been a lot of tightening up for that.
Mhm. So I think another big thing that has been a burden on manufacturers is the need for clinical evidence.
Oh,
And
yeah.
so talking about the scope of things that, tripled, the CERs probably likely more than tripled in their content and expectation. And then the notified bodies started getting ridiculous with what they were asking for. And it was almost like it was getting to be a power trip by the clinical assessors because they were had a godlike role, like yes or no, and it had to meet all of their expectations, whether it was a regulatory requirement or not. And Ty, do
Yeah.
you remember we got like ridiculous feedback about like why for interosseous IV did they not contraindicate it for use in the spine? And the company came out, they're like, what? Who? This is not standard. Why would we even think that they would put it in the spine? And the reviewer had found an article that in veterinary use in large cats that they regularly gave this IV in the spine of lions and tigers. Oh my.
Yeah.
And my
No,
customer was supposed to put in their clinical evaluation that this was not for use in human spines because it was okay for cat spines.
I mean, the anatomy might be a smidge different there. Yeah, the clinical evidence burden is pretty extreme, and there's a lot of challenge with what's called wet devices, well-established technology, because there's not clinical literature on a reusable hemostat. There's not clinical
Or a
literature
or a scalpel.
on a scalpel, on even sutures.
Mhm.
Technology been around 40 years on catheters. Like, there's just not much to say about something that's already been said for
I
this.
have over the years I've seen webinars from 4 different notified bodies talk about wet and the clinical evidence expectation. And I have seen literally 4 different opinions on how to interpret the guidance document on wet from the European Commission.
And
So
then,
there's so much that nobody knows.
yep, you have that clinical evidence piece, but once you do get commercialized, it has to stay updated, and now you have a huge suite of post-market surveillance requirements and documents. You used to have your post-market surveillance plan and report, and that was used to feed in your clinical evidence research. It was supposed to be, okay, we've already done our submission. We're taking a look at what we did on in industry. We're soliciting feedback to see if there's anything else. Okay, now we update our clinical evidence report, on a 2 to 3 year frequency. Now, depending on the device classification, you can have 4 different reports that go into it. You have your post-market surveillance plan and then the report. Then you have your periodic safety plan and report, and then you have your post-market clinical follow-up plan and report. So it's that whole alphabet soup of rehashing the same kind of documentation, but it's so burdensome for industry in a sense that you have 4 documents: the clinical plan or your clinical evaluation report, post-market surveillance report, your periodic safety update report, and your post-market clinical follow-up report, and they all gotta at least have the same consistency in what you're searching and what your device says and what you say your device does and your baseline data, because that's all gets hashed out 4 individual times. So it's kind of a mess of which one do you do first? How are they informing the others? Are you lagging behind because you have to update these annually? So the clinical cycle is very burdensome, very dynamic, and you see people hiring left and right, but we're all still, even 5 years later, interpreting what they actually think is a functional workflow.
Mhm. So on that note, let's talk more about the notified bodies between the MDD and the MDR, and then the languages in MDR. So MDD, there was, I want to say, almost 80 notified bodies that were designated by competent authorities to be able to do the product assessments. Well, there were people that were, there were notified bodies that were notorious for being like too easy. Like they weren't asking the technical questions, and it was just almost like a rubber stamp. Um, and then so part of the transition between the MDD and MDR is they disqualified all of the notified bodies, and you had to reapply underneath MDR for designation. And it was a very lengthy, very strenuous process. And to this date, we're like still like, I think right around or maybe even a little less than 50 notified bodies over
Yep.
the last, since 2017, years.
Oh yeah, and when MDR came into effect, industry was given a transition time, and so were notified bodies. When MDR came into effect, I think there was something like 10 for the first year, and you're talking every single product on market was heavily either up-classified, needed to be reclassified, and you'd have to self-certify, and then you have to have a reevaluation in a transition plan and still maintain both your MDD and plan to transition to MDR, and you're talking about 10 notified bodies when you first launched this. It was a bottlenecked disaster. And
Mhm.
after they got their redesignation, they had to be so strict because the competent authorities were so strict with them that it ultimately felt almost like a punishment for people who came first because they got the worst reviews by trying to do the right thing and being first to market under the MDR. It's
Mhm.
quite a challenging time. It's a lot better now, but it was painful.
Yeah. So if MDR was a relationship status on Facebook, I think most companies have changed their relationship status to it's complicated. Most companies that they documented that they're going to break up.
Yeah,
They're-
I think there were a lot of breakups with the EU, unfortunately.
I think
Um,
there's a whole lot of companies that have chosen not to transition to the MDR because it is so timely and so expensive. And now the European Council has realized that they have created this perfect storm where nobody wants to sell product on the EU market because not only is it so cumbersome to get the product on market and expensive, it's cumbersome and expensive to maintain it on
yeah,
market. So
so
there's even big Fortune 100 companies that are withdrawing up to 20% of their product lines because they're like, this does not make financial sense for us to do this. So that's almost all small companies can't, they're not well funded enough. Their products might not be high tech enough to get reimbursement. Like, what do you do if you are the guy that sells scalpels?
yeah. I
And
mean,
now you gotta
that
have
your
clinical
profit
data
line
on the
was immense.
utility of a scalpel. Like,
Yeah.
yeah,
Uh, what is it? I mean, what can, companies do or people do to kind of at least, if they're going to go EU MDR, which there's lots of reasons to go EU MDR. It's a big market. And obviously, at the end of the day, we're not in med device to make money. There's easier ways to make money. We're here to help people. What
sometimes I question my own life decisions in that area.
we're definitely choosing a harder path for that. What does it mean for people in Europe and what does it mean for organizations? Is there, any silver linings? Is there anything that can kind of help them navigate this transitionary period? Because it's complex, it's complicated, like the relationship status, or it's over and we're done.
Well,
so
see,
far.
that's the $1,000,000 question that still is to be TBD. Is it's like, okay, I think that the European Council created a bigger problem in lack of access to devices than they were solving with over legislation of people who have integrity issues.
I see. Yeah. I mean, I think for me, what I think was a really good positive coming out of MDR is at least some of the device classification rules and addressing some products that were so new and novel when those were created that they didn't have good categories and went unregulated. Like, I do think it's nice that IVDR is actually holding some people accountable for what they're saying about their
Under
diagnostics.
a severely underregulated category that should be highly regulated.
Which should be highly regulated, and same with software. I'm glad that software is getting a little bit more scrutiny because it can really go off the rails, and I have family members or healthcare providers, and we were talking about this earlier. Company or, hospitals and systems aren't they don't understand regulatory like us. So if they see that something has a self-certification or a clearance or they're class 1, they don't know if they're going above and beyond the regulation of what's actually allowed. And so they will implement something based off of marketing alone, not knowing that they're exceeding their regulatory requirements, and then trust it with blind faith. So I'm glad to see that software, especially those adjunct softwares that are kind of, used for diagnostic purposes, used to inform patient healthcare decisions, are getting higher levels of scrutiny. That's my silver lining. I think that some of those technologies were worth updating those classification
Mhm.
rules to capture.
With all that said, before we wrap up, we've got one more fun question for you, along the lines of our real and ridiculous, but a different flavor, if you will, because we already know MDR is real, whether you want it to be or not. And with it being real, if it was a movie genre, what would it be?
Yeah. Would you say, okay, here are your categories, and leave us a note in the comments on what you think it is based off of our rather candid conversation today. Do you think it was a thriller, B, a sci-fi, C, a comedy, D, a documentary, or E, a horror? Drop your letter. Let us know why you think what it is in the comments.
Mhm. So we'll share our favorite comments on the next episode. And honestly, there are no wrong answers, just very deep feelings about it.
Deep feelings. Obviously, we have a lot of feelings.
Mhm.
So, we'll
So
see you
next week
next
on
one.
Device and Conquer, we're coming home for a little regulatory sightseeing. So we'll be back on this side of the pond.
Yep. Next week, we'll dive into FDA 101, the other regulatory giant.